Hey, it's the Worth Knowing live stream on the Cliff's Edge channel on YouTube. We're on Twitter. We're on Facebook. I'm Matt Robison. We're here on my Substack, Worth Knowing. And if you're here from the Tony Michaels Show, welcome back. If you've been on here before with our host, Cliff Schechter, he's here, he's there, he's every frickin' where like Roy Kent. Sometimes here, sometimes not. And sometimes I start and he pops in unexpectedly. He's like the Spanish Inquisition. No one expects him. But I'll tell you what everyone could expect. Corruption, lots of it, festering, gelatinous, depraved, venal, brazen, red-handed corruption. We knew we were going to get it. From the start of the 2016 campaign, there was so much reporting available, including from a friend of this show, Greg Olear, about how the Russian mafia and Russian oligarchs, they're kind of interchangeable, had used the Trump organization for decades as a Russian laundromat to clean up their money by pumping it through his real estate, through Trump Tower, by allowing shell companies to purchase properties. We knew it when Wilbur Ross was appointed to a cabinet position in the first term because Ross was at the epicenter of another Russian laundromat for dirty money in the Bank of Cyprus. We knew it when heaps of Russian money started showing up out of the blue. Well, that's kind of a mixed metaphor there, but out of the blue in Republican campaigns, like when Len Blavatnik, a Russian oligarch, funneled $3.5 million into a PAC associated with Mitch McConnell, and another $1.5 million into a PAC associated with Marco Rubio, and another $1.1 million into a PAC associated with Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker. But the king of all the corruption, of course, was Donald Trump. He had scammed veterans out of charitable contributions, and he'd scammed students out of an education with his Trump University, and he'd scammed small business contractors out of getting paid for their work, which made him the subject of, true story, you can look this up, 4,000 lawsuits. Seriously, look it up in USA Today. And Donald Trump sued them, not me. When he was in office, he was scamming people by getting them to make emoluments through the Trump Hotel. Then he was out of office and he was scamming people with his Trump NFTs. And of course, Truth Social, that was a meme stock. It got pumped up despite the underlying business losing tens of millions of dollars. Scam. And the last 2 months since getting back into office, Trump has sent his sons around the world. This is from the New York Times. Again, sue them, not me. On a blitz of family money-making ventures to capitalize on Trump resuming the presidency. That's included Don Jr. cozying up to a Cayman Islands-based crypto company that was previously fined $45 million by the SEC for violating securities law and pushing to expand business for Trump meme coins and cryptocurrencies. So, like I said, this ain't the Spanish Inquisition. Everyone could have expected this. And yet, this whole Trump Force One jet from the Qataris, $400 million gift, is just, it's next level. The whole episode is so ugly, and it's part of a string of step-on-rake failures, including the China trade war and the planned cuts to Medicaid and multiple federal judges shutting down his unconstitutional scheme to grab people off the streets and imprison them in foreign gulags. And yet, it was only a little more than 6 months ago that Americans decided, expecting all of this, knowing that there was a real possibility that all of this could happen, people like me and today's guest, who's coming up in a second, talking about it, writing about it, Americans looked and they put him back in office. They looked at the alternatives. They said, nope, this guy. It's something that Democrats have to grapple with. It's really not clear that we Democrats have stared that proposition in the face and hit our moment of clarity to say, okay, we need to shake things up and turn things around. So that's what I want to talk about today. There's a growing chorus of writers and political analysts and party activists who are saying similar and related things about what exactly needs to happen for Democrats to beat this whole horror show and get back on track. I've actually got a forthcoming article in Newsweek about it, should be out tomorrow. And my guest today just wrote an outstanding piece about it for the Liberal Patriot on Substack. Let's bring him in. Michael Baharaeen is the chief political analyst for the Liberal Patriot. He is from Kansas City and then relocated for all intents and purposes to Georgia and then Washington, D.C. He writes the excellent Substack himself, Checks and Balances. Michael, welcome.
Hey, Matt. Thank you for having me.
Well, it's delightful to have you. I've been a fan of your writing for a long time, and I would like to give you your welcome gift, which is a jet. It's not as nice as the Qatari one, It's basically made of Legos, but that is apparently the way you greet people in this day and age. So welcome.
Thank you. I'll look for that in the mail. Thanks.
What? You're a data guy. You're a numbers guy. And so I'm kind of asking this question with that thought in mind. Of all the rakes that Trump has stepped on, which one do you think, which one, first of all, stood out the most to you as like, oh my gosh, like head slap. I can't believe this one. And which one do you think is actually going to have staying power and stick with him and do the most damage?
Yeah. I mean, the Qatari airplane is, I know it's the most recent example. It's, I've seen some of Trump's own supporters on Fox News, on, other right-leaning outlets, basically saying, come on, dude, what are you doing here? When you've got your own people who support you, who want to cheer for you, kind of saying, all right, hold on a second. I think, maybe you've used up your goodwill in some ways. The thing, look, I mean, I think Americans do care about corruption. I think part of the problem for Democrats, and we can maybe get into this later, is that they don't necessarily believe that Democrats are necessarily that much better in their own right. I think if Trump continues down this road, there may be an opening for Democrats to kind of hit him on some of this stuff. But the bigger, rake that he stepped on, so to speak, I think was the trade war. I think Trump's the thing that propelled Trump back to office more than anything else, and there were, it's multitude of factors, but the top issue in every pre-election poll and every post-election survey and the exit polls was inflation. It was the cost of living. People were fed up with what they felt was Biden's inability to do anything about this, even though I think you could argue that some of the causes of inflation were pretty complicated, and that in some ways the U.S. was in better shape than other countries were. But nonetheless, people were frustrated with it. They saw the prices at the grocery stores, the gas pump, housing, rent. And so it was the big thing that kind of helped propel Trump back to the presidency. And what's interesting is that I went back, and this was a month or two ago, so I suppose things may have changed a little since then, but I went back and looked at all the executive orders that he had passed in kind of the initial flurry, in his first month or two, where he really was just kind of ignoring Congress and saying, I'm going to do all this stuff myself. And I went back and I searched for mentions of inflation, of cost of living, and there was barely any mention of it. He was not, this issue that he said, I'm going to come in and I'm going to fix it, all of a sudden was just nowhere to be seen in his agenda. And you started to see before long, I mean, it didn't take long for his approval rating to start ticking down. And the issue that was driving that was inflation and cost of living, kind of the economy more broadly. He still had broad support for immigration. He still had support in other areas. So this is, I think, his weak spot. And so when he launches this trade war with China, and all of a sudden people start to understand that there may be real consequences for them, in their personal lives, in their communities, price of goods is going to go up again. And that was something that they elected him to fix. I think that is, this is the kind of thing that impacts people's daily lives. I mean, I would never argue that the corruption stuff, and I think that's a very real problem, isn't a big deal. But I think for a lot of voters, that is in some ways baked in a little bit in their calculus of Trump. They care about him as an outsider who is going to come in, shake up the establishment, and specifically do things that impact their personal lives and make them better. And his trade war with China, his ability to, do anything to address inflation on the early end, I think that's going to be the opening for Democrats if they can kind of keep their eye on the ball in the weeks and months ahead.
The bottom line is their bottom line. That's what they really care about. And we've got some comments coming in. I want to invite people to keep commenting. One of the things, you and I are meeting for the first time. I've been a longtime reader of your writing, and yet it feels like I know you. There's this immediacy to Substack that's really quite incredible. Yeah. And I'm finding it with these live streams as well. There are all kinds of people. I don't know who they are in real life. They might not be real human beings. It's like a Ready Player One scenario where, I don't know, maybe your AI avatar is like, it's possible. But some of my favorite commenters are at it in the comments, including this one from Lefty Gramps, underscoring your point that, hey, corruption, not necessarily a deal breaker for Trump's supporters. And then you've got this person's handle. I'm not going to say it out loud. I'm not going to say it out loud. This is very, very clever of you. I see what you're doing. You might be punking me, but I do love it. But the comment here from VD space HURTZ, spell it out for yourself, people, is that MAGA and Americans love a soaring stock market, and it's soaring again. It raises for me, Michael, this question I wanted to lob at you. There is another prominent writer, Substacker. I'm not going to call him out because this was a private email exchange. We were speculating together, kind of offline, about this whole Qatari jet situation. It does bear some of the hallmarks of a typical Trump ploy, which is kind of the rotating credit card debt of scandal, which is like, I'm doing some bad stuff over here, or I have a story I don't like over here, so I'm gonna get your attention. Oh, look over here, I'm the magic man. And the fact that it emerged through sources inform us, to ABC News, it's a little suspicious. And so it almost made me wonder, is it possible that they want this out there to blot out something else? And so that's really the question that I think that the comment raises, which is, are people going to keep their eye on what you say is the core bottom line story that has real peril for Trump, the way he's hurt people's pocketbooks, the damage he's inflicted on all of us and our cost of living? Are people going to keep sight of that? Or are they going to get distracted either by his circus of stuff, Qatari jets and whatnot, or by the stock market?
Yeah. Well, it's a good question. I think, we've had some hints that this is, not even hints, they're not very subtle, some statements that this is part of their MO. This is part of what they do. I think back when, I can't remember if it was around the Abrego Garcia deportation or the young woman in Harvard or Cambridge, somewhere, one of these kind of, can you believe it, immigration related stories that happened. There was just kind of a almost overlooked line in the New York Times from White House press secretary, basically saying well, we essentially saying we are doing this in part because we don't want people to be dwelling on essentially the stock market crashing or something. So we kind of know that they do this. I think the polling, what I've seen in the latest surveys, I would say I think and maybe it hasn't picked up the Qatari jet issue recently enough, but we've seen that as there has been some promise of kind of a return to normalcy on the trade relations front, specifically with China, you have seen his approval rating just tick back up a little bit over the last couple of weeks. And so I do think that I think Americans might be paying, pretty close attention, at least to the stuff, again, that kind of impacts their day-to-day lives, right? So I think his approval rating was sinking as it seemed like things were spiraling out of control on that front. I mean, you can basically see the correlation between the news stories about, how bad the trade war was going and his declining approval. Now we all of a sudden have stories about maybe he's gonna normalize relations a little bit with China. He's gonna pause some of the tariffs. I mean, he did that already with a bunch of other countries, and you started to kind of see him recover a little bit. He's still underwater right now, but that to me indicates, and I was actually kind of surprised seeing how closely that tracked with the economic news. So to me, it indicates that at least for some portion of Americans who aren't necessarily dyed-in-the-wool Trump supporters, but who maybe want to give him a little bit of a leash and give him a little bit of time to kind of do the things that he said he was going to do, that they're, pretty clued in to the economic news, to the trade war, the tariffs, that kind of stuff. And that they're giving feedback basically in real time on that basis. That seems to be the main thing that is kind of driving a lot of his political standing right now.
I do want to pick up on that thread, and I'll just say first that I owe an apology to the commenter who I flashed up on the screen, the explanation that his name is Vincent David. So VD Hertz, I apologize. Listen, I used to be the chief of staff for a member of Congress who was preceded in Congress by a man who insisted on going by the name Dick Sweat. Famous congressman from New Hampshire's 2nd Congressional District, held for 2 terms, lost. He's a lovely man. His daughter was an intern in our office, and sometimes, it just works out that way. So there you go. So speaking of distractions, you were just saying that there's been a little bit of recovery. I mean, maybe the circus, maybe the sleight of hand is working a little bit, and there's a little bit of an effect of, hey, I'm making things bad, and now I'm undoing some of the damage I caused. So see, things are getting better. And yet this morning you wrote on the Liberal Patriot that it really may not be enough. That you have a case to be made that, as you say, this is the title, Democrats can't rely on Trump's struggles. Why can't Democrats just rely on Trump's struggles?
Yeah. There's a lot of polling, and it's been since before the election, and then it kind of culminated in a really low point earlier this year, showing that Democrats themselves are viewed pretty miserably. I think it was a Quinnipiac poll from January or February that had their approval rating in the low 20% range. And there have been a lot of subsequent polls that have shown the same thing. Now, some of that is from their own voters. There has certainly been some consternation among self-identified Democrats about the Democrats' response to Trump early on. Even though one of the interesting kind of developments after this election was that a lot of Democratic voters wanted the party to kind of ideologically moderate a little bit in some ways. I mean, this was close to about 50% of self-identified Democrats in a Gallup poll, but they also wanted the party to show some fight against Trump. And so I think part of the reason that Democrats are suffering so much is that it's not just Republicans who view them poorly. Independents have a pretty low approval of them, and some of their own voters aren't even fully on board. But beyond that, I think the Democrats are going to have a little bit of, it's going to take a little time to recover from the Biden years. And, I think there were a fair amount of things that happened under Biden. Some I think objectively good that a lot of Americans approved of, the bipartisan infrastructure bill, the CHIPS Act, some of the COVID recovery policies. But I think Democrats lost a lot of trust in the public by seeming to kind of cover up the state that Biden was in, pretty much just saying we are going to handpick his successor, and there's not going to really be a small d democratic process to do this, and watching them fail at that and bring Trump back to power. And, you can go kind of down the list of any number of other reasons that Democrats are kind of vulnerable, including the fact that their coalition has kind of crumbled over the last decade or so. But, I think part of the reason that I argue that Trump's failures may not necessarily lead to the Democrats bouncing back is because some of their issues aren't just resolved by Trump, being unpopular, because they are not just as unpopular. In a lot of these polls, they are less popular than Trump as well as Republicans. So they have some work to do. And some of this isn't going to just be, well, Trump, look, he's corrupt. And people are like, yeah, we know, we don't care. Like, what do you have for us? What's your agenda? What are you offering that's different? And how can we trust you? After the last 4 years, where a lot of people's trust in the Democrats kind of fell to a low point.
All right, let's talk a little bit about the fix here. I think you make a compelling case that, and this has kind of been the debate going back and forth between Democrats, which is like, hey, let's not get in the way. We're all having a good time here watching him crater. And as you just pointed out, that may not keep going. Just the fact that at the 100-day mark, he was at, by all accounts, the low water mark for 100-day polling in history doesn't mean that trend is going to continue. And he may have a dead cat bounce. He may just hit his natural floor. He has, it seems like for some of his MAGA trolls, the cruelty is great. They love it. And so, he may bounce back from that. But what got me going on the idea of, all right, I'm going to take a step back here. Sometimes this happens. I don't know how many of the people commenting, viewing right now are writers themselves. I'm sure this has happened to other people than me. But what happened was I have been kind of rattling around on the idea of, all right, what's sort of the direction that Democrats need to go? What's sort of the killer app for them? And I hit on a theme. I hit on an idea. And I wrote to my editor at Newsweek and I said, here's my pitch. And, he sent me some helpful feedback and we bounced back and forth. And I'm mentioning that seemingly dull detail because in the course of waiting for a few days and doing that bounce back and forth, that kind of creative process, you came in and scooped me. I'm not unhappy about it. It's cool. It's all good. But you wrote a piece that said a lot of what the heck I wanted to say. And you made the case that the theme that's needed here is, and the pivot that Democrats need to make is, I'll toss it to you. You got to say it first.
Yeah. The theme is that Democrats need to truly embrace kind of being the party of change, and positive change, and kind of a rejection of things that have not worked in the past, essentially. So basically the way that I wrote it, if you want me to talk a little bit about the piece, is it dawned on me that a lot of, when I hear Democrats talk a lot today, they talk, especially elected Democrats, but also voters, they talk as defenders of institutions, defenders of kind of the establishment. There was some exit poll data that indicated basically that for voters who wanted small change in the last election or no change, Kamala Harris won them overwhelmingly. The share of the electorate that said they wanted small to no change was under 10%. Most people wanted substantial change. That was, I think, a majority, 50 something. And then there was a line of people who wanted complete and total upheaval, which was about a third of the electorate. A sign that people were not happy with the status quo, and they saw Harris as, and kind of Biden by extension, as defending the status quo. They're defending the establishment. And so, kind of the case that I made for Democrats is that they have to figure out a way, and it doesn't necessarily require completely rejecting all establishments and institutions. I think that healthy democracies certainly have robust institutions that have a lot of trust in them. But it's worth understanding that people don't have the same levels of trust across the board in a lot of these institutions that they do. And speaking to that, whether it's calling for accountability in their own form of Doge, it doesn't have to be these sweeping, kind of cuts that Musk has done without much thought to them. But maybe it's like, hey, you know what? The Defense Department is a little bloated, or even some kind of sacred cows of liberals, Health and Human Services or the CDC or the State Department could stand to have some reforms to them, right? Speaking to this thing that exists out there in the country, that people are just tired of Washington, they're tired of the establishment, they're tired of elites. Speaking to it and kind of saying, here's our plan, which we think is better than what Trump and Musk are doing, right? I think that's kind of one piece of this that they can do. But the other piece, and I didn't actually add this to my article, but I've been thinking about the fact that when you looked at the 2024 and I think 2020 RNC conventions in the summer where Trump received the party nomination, it was very conspicuous who was missing from there, which were past party leaders. George W. Bush, nowhere to be seen when he was alive. George H.W. Bush was not there. You didn't have John Boehner. You didn't have Mitt Romney, John McCain showing up. And part of the reason, and a lot of people kind of observed this and they thought, well, what the heck? Trump's just kind of, discarding all of these leaders from the party's past. And I don't think his voters minded. I think a lot of them viewed the old vanguard of the Republican Party as people who were from a bygone era, who didn't understand, the needs of people today, who didn't even represent what they wanted today. And then I look over at the Democrats, and since 2024, the Democrats' Twitter account has been, posting stuff about Kamala Harris at the Met Gala, and Joe Biden has been making appearances with the new DNC chair, and kind of coming back around, despite the fact that he left office as one of the lowest approval ratings in the party's history, or in presidential history. And I think for the Democrats, they have to kind of grapple with this. Like I think there's a tendency to want to defend people in your tribe, to defend the status quo, to defend things that you think work for you. But a lot of Americans don't think that. And at this point, frankly, a lot of Democratic voters exhibited in a lot of pre-election polling, at least with Biden, don't really want him in the picture anymore either. And yet he's kind of going around on his tour right now, kind of making a comeback and trying to kind of protect his reputation in his post-presidency time. So, there's a lot of stuff that you can kind of pull at here, but I think this is one of the key things that Democrats have to understand right now, which is that people just, regardless of what they think their elected members think, their staff, the kind of institutions that are around the party, the issue groups and stuff, a lot of people are sick of Washington. They're sick of politics as usual, and they want somebody who is offering a new way. And that so far has come in the form of Trump. We saw a little bit of that in Bernie Sanders on the left in 2016. And even before that, we saw that with Barack Obama in 2008. So there is a desire for change, their desire for something new that's not politics as usual. And whichever candidate at this moment seems to be offering that more so than the other, I think is going to have a little bit of an advantage.
I want to pick up on a thread that's coming up in the comments where a number of people are saying, look, we hear you, but let's not forget that Donald Trump is the one who thought that water could electrocute sharks and is totally frickin' mumbling incoherent and gave the worst performance in debate history, except for the guy standing next to him. The fact that Biden had several malapropisms and stumbles obscured the fact that Donald Trump was in full, scale meltdown himself. And that is true. That is absolutely true. I think the problem that you and I are trying to, in our own writing, deal with is the fact that that may be the case, but for whatever reason, people are not seeing it. People's trust in Democrats is actually lower. The Democratic brand is actually lower right now than the Republican brand and then the Trump brand. I was going over this 2 weeks ago when David Pepper was on the show, and it's really quite remarkable. And so in some way, we have to deal with the fact, I've been working for this party in one form or another for 3 decades. And my very first political experience was actually working for Bill Clinton in 1992. I was volunteering on his campaign. And, I remember the theme. The theme was the famous haiku: change versus more of the same, the economy stupid, don't forget healthcare. Yeah. And I think you and I are both pointing out, and again, my article isn't quite out yet, that there's a lot of wisdom in that. And it takes me back to an experience. I mentioned before that I used to be the chief of staff for a congressman from New Hampshire. And he was the co-chair of Barack Obama's 2008 presidential campaign. So we were doing some work for the campaign. And on election day, we were literally going around to downtown polling places in Concord, New Hampshire. And one weird feature of the New Hampshire presidential primary is if you're not registered as a Republican or a Democrat, if you're an undeclared, which basically means independent, you can actually decide to vote in either party's presidential nominating primary. And so we were talking to voters, scads and scads of voters at the polling places, January 8th, 2008. And a substantial number, a really shocking number, were saying that they were trying to decide between McCain and Obama. And, it's really puzzling in a way, because as Paul was remarking, Obama's to the left of JFK and McCain is to the right of Attila the Hun. These are not ideologically similar people. Yeah. And yet voters were kind of taking away from them, they both are different. They're both running against the system. They both represent change. Now, you put in your article some fairly compelling numbers to show that the reason that Barack Obama became president and not McCain above anything else is that he won the change battle. They saw him as an even bigger change agent than McCain. And so, again, just to bring this back full circle to the comments here, I agree. You and I aren't denigrating Joe Biden. We're just trying to deal with the fact that voters see him as not with it enough to be president, despite all of Trump's insanity. And they see him as representing the status quo. And the position that Democrats have gotten forced into, shoehorned into, as we've had to step up and defend everything that Trump has attacked in his rampage through the government over the last 3 months, is we've been put in the position of defending institutions, defending the status quo. You know what Americans hate? Institutions. They are really down on institutions, including the military, corporations, the government. And I agree with the commenter who said, look, I just want, who was it who said this? I just want the government to do their job well and represent us. Here, Susie Jones. I want government to do what we elected them to do and what we pay them to do. I want the government to take care of the people. Absolutely. And so, it's been tough for Democrats because that's what we care about. We've been put in this position of trying to defend, and yet we have to somehow become the party of change again. That's the argument that I wanted to make and that you beat me to the punch on making, is we need, above everything else, to be the party of change. So here's what hung me up. Here's why you beat me to the punch. My editor's question to me was, gee, Matt, how can Democrats be the party of change when we have to defend so much that Trump is put under attack? What's your answer to that? Yeah. How can they do that?
I mean, it's a good question. I think they're going to benefit from the fact that, Trump is now the establishment, and 4 years from now, we are going to be through Trump second term, right? And so a lot of the changes suddenly that we're going to see inevitably over the next 3+ years at this point, are going to create a new reality, a new political landscape. And so in some ways, I'm going to sound like I'm kind of contradicting my article from today, but in some ways, for Democrats, it's sort of like let the Trump second term play out, and voters will start to feel, the effects of this. And I think, part of why I think Biden won in 2020, despite not really being a quote unquote change candidate, despite voters even then, I mean, you can go back to look at polling in 2020, voters had concerns about his age and his mental acuity even then. But part of the reason he won, I mean, frankly, probably the reason he won, was because we had a once in a century pandemic. And it kind of created a pause in this era of, we want big sweeping change, we want complete and total upheaval, whatever the phrase was in the exit polls, where people suddenly realized, whoa, wait a second. Okay, we're living in a very unstable period right now. We're feeling insecure, whether it's financially or with our health or whatever. And Trump, maybe we don't need somebody who is, saying that we should inject, bleach or ivermectin or whatever. And maybe we at this point want to listen to what the scientific authorities have. And Biden kind of came along just at that time. He was a seasoned statesman. He was, party elder, and he said, I'm going to return us to normalcy. But what's kind of crazy, and this is what sort of hurt the Democrats, is just how quickly things changed after that. You started to have runaway inflation. Again, not necessarily Biden's fault, but something that he was kind of having a little bit of trouble tamping down on. You also had problems with immigration at the southern border, where all of a sudden people's kind of worst fears about Biden seemed to be coming true, which was that he is, he's an older guy, he's frail, he's weak. And now look what's happening at the border. Look what happened with the withdrawal in Afghanistan. Look at what's happening to the economy. This guy who just said, I'm going to return us to normalcy. This is anything but that. And you started seeing in polling throughout like 2023, 2024, as kind of Biden was really hitting his low point in his approval rating, you were starting to see voters looking back on Trump's first term more fondly. And specifically, they were remembering what the economy was like under Trump's first term. And we can debate, I think that a lot of that was due to the economy that he inherited. Regardless, people felt like they were living in a more kind of stable time in that period. And in the fallout of COVID, you had, cities experiencing more crime. You had cost of living issues. You still had kind of just day-to-day health concerns and stuff like this. And all of a sudden, people were like, well, you know what, our effort to return to normalcy and just kind of go with the status quo, that didn't work. So we're going to go back to the guy who promised he was going to be a wrecking ball. And, where it kind of hurt Kamala Harris was that she was a part of this administration. And even though she was trying desperately to brand herself as the candidate of change, people just did not see that. And so, to your broader question, what do Democrats do from here? I mean, I think, first of all, we kind of talked about this a little bit earlier, speaking to people's concerns about government institutions and not kind of poo-pooing them as like, that's just, fake news, or that's, coming from Fox News, and that's, we don't need to worry about that. I think people have legitimate concerns, and ignoring them isn't going to help. So I think speaking those concerns, saying, look, we want accountability in government too. We're the party that thinks that government can do good for people, but the only way that that's going to happen is if people have trust in it, right? And if the only way they're going to have trust in it is if these institutions are working for people, and they are showing these results and showing that they're improving people's lives. And this is something that Pete Buttigieg does a really good job of. He's kind of been making the rounds recently, and talking on these kind of right of center podcasts, and people are realizing, oh, wait a second, actually the government does do good things, and we don't want to just completely gut it, right? So I think some of this is just kind of dialoguing with the public and saying, look, we get it. You're right. Government's not perfect, and it hasn't delivered in a lot of ways, and we don't want to defend that just reflexively. But gutting it the way that Trump's doing, that's not the answer either. This is actually going to have a really negative impact on your day-to-day life. And so we're going to be the party that does this smartly. We're going to, approach it with a chisel rather than a wrecking ball.
I have my own formulation that's close to yours for how to do this, very delicate high wire act. And here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to live test it with you. And
right.
If you want to, in front of people, if you want to say, Matt, you're wrong, that's cool. I'm with
All
it.
Right. Let's do it.
Here's what I wrote. And you know what? Actually, you'd be doing me a service, because the piece is sitting with my editor, and I think he hasn't hit publish yet. Unless I go running to newsweek.com and it's up, I could still stop the presses. I went back for inspiration on this to that haiku I mentioned, and it starts with change versus more of the same. And the reason that I think Carville started with change versus more of the same is that it was a reminder to Democrats to just boil it down. Mm-hmm. Let's just keep this simple, guys. Donald Trump, as many people who have been commenting here or are reminding us, he is an unhinged lunatic. He is not well. But one of the things that he does is he doesn't feel the need to come up with a brilliant Elizabeth Warren-esque 10-point paper on each change proposal he has. He just kind of snarl shouts it yeehaw style. I'm not suggesting that we become that. That's not my idea here. But I do think keeping it simple. And yes, Corey Barton, this is live. We are live right now. So I could light my whole career on fire by saying something dumb. I think that keeping this really simple to we are about change, that's the starting point. That's the first thing, is saying, like you just said, saying there are things that need to change. And by the way, it might have to be things in government. Going back to Susie Jones's comment earlier, people want government to work. And I think acknowledging that not everything about government works is a good starting place. Not everything that government does is right. Now, I know that does line up a little bit with Trump's message, right? A couple more steps down that road and you end up with Doge. I think that Americans can understand the nuance between, we all agree we need an extreme home makeover in America. You guys messed up and hired an arsonist. You wanted a general contractor. Let us come in and do that for you. I think that's a starting point. I'll give you my second one, and then I'll pause for breath and let you get in a word edgewise, which is the economy stupid. And it goes back again to a point you were making earlier. I prompted you, for those just joining, what of the many rakes that Donald Trump has stepped on is the one that's going to really leave that mark on his face? Oh, what a great visual image. I love it. Oh, like a nice black eye, like a nice shiner right there. And you said, well, it's the cost of living. It's the inflation. It's the tariff war. It's just the abject stupidity playing with live ammunition with our economy and our livelihoods. And I think there's a lot in that. I also think, though, that we can't simply run on, to your point this morning, we're going to undo what Trump did. Yeah. I think the return to normalcy theme worked. As many people agreed with you in the comments, in 2020 because of the unprecedented pandemic situation. It would not be a theme that would work as a rebranding for the Democratic Party. For that, I think there are a lot of ideas going around right now. The abundance agenda from Derek Thompson and Ezra Klein, Mark Dunkelman, and his whole idea, like, hey, we've really kind of become the party of lawsuits and red tape and process instead of let's build things. Let's build a lot of clean energy. Let's build a lot of housing. Let's get people a comfortable, abundant lifestyle where we build good things and people earn great wages. While I was in the midst of going back and forth with my editor, my daughter had a basketball tournament, and I was sitting with some other dads. The team was getting lunch, and I was in a food court at a mall. I was looking around, and unlike the image that many of us grew up with, where like mall food court jobs were like Fast Times at Ridgemont High, a bunch of teenagers, that's not these folks who are working there. These are people, these are adults who I think look around and feel stuck on the income ladder. There's not rungs above that in the food court service sector industry. We need to give people a real income ladder. And there was a comment here, and I don't want to misattribute it. It might have been Lefty Gramps saying, progressive policies are popular. We have to, and we have to bear that in mind. And I agree with MJ. Everyone's stuck on the income ladder, 100%. And I think the difference is that Bernie Sanders identified the problem correctly, but a lot of his solution didn't quite resonate either. It wasn't, in a way, it wasn't subversive enough. It was, a lot of Green New Deal, Medicare for all. Those might be smart and worthy policies, but they just don't resonate. The big government route just doesn't resonate with enough voters. And so to me, I think it's much more in the vein of Democrats. We are relentlessly focused on giving you opportunity, giving you upward mobility, giving you a way to rise up that income ladder. And we're going to cut away all the obstacles in your path, whether they come from government or they come from big corporations or they come from oligarchs trying to restrict your rights. I said, wow, I filibustered. I'm ready for the Senate court, Booker. Call me up, man. All right, over to you. Those are my first two. I'll hold on.
Yeah. No. There's a lot of good stuff.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff I just said out of my face hole.
Well, so I think I would agree on both points. Look, I think, the Democrats in 2020, well, it was a strange time. You were kind of watching the party work through its identity in a lot of ways. And one of the things that certainly was tried in the primary process was we should have thoroughly detailed, basically like theses that we are going to submit to the public for their review. And it ended up, the party ended up getting so bogged down in details of policy that they forgot that they were just having a conversation with the public, right? And this is just as a brief aside here, this is one of the, I think, vulnerabilities politically that the party has right now, that I think it would be wise to reflect on a little bit, is that, as the economy has changed, as we've moved kind of to a post-industrial world with a lot more knowledge economy jobs, the Democrats have become the party of highly educated Americans. At least people who have lots of formal education, right? Specifically grad students, a lot of college degree holders. And, so their candidates are starting to reflect that. Their staff are starting to reflect that. And so I'm sure Elizabeth Warren, for example, truly thought, like, I'm going to show people how, my wits, my intelligence is, I outclass everybody in this field. And it might have spoken to that part of the Democratic base, but in a way that really just for a lot of other Americans was like, kind of their eyes glazed over. Okay, you're too far in the weeds of energy policy or education policy right now. I just want to know like what you're going to do to give me a better job, right? And so I think for Democrats, kind of understanding who their main audience is, right? In a lot of ways, their core voters will be with them. I think most voters will be with them no matter what. They're trying to get the next kind of next layer of voters. Are trying to get swing voters. Are trying to win, states for Senate races that have a disproportionately high share of rural voters, people in these areas that may not have as high of levels of education. And that doesn't mean you need to, talk to them like they're dumb, but you have to realize that what might work for, your audience of people who live, in big metro areas, work in the knowledge economy, have lots of degrees, that's not going to play everywhere else. Right? So I think to your first point about keeping things simple, right? Obama was so good at this, and Obama himself was highly educated. He was a professor, but he could talk to you. He could talk to almost anybody. He could walk into a bar, and he was, a generational political talent in this way, but he could walk into a bar or a diner or something and just ask somebody about their farm, ask somebody about their family, what they do for a living. And even though he was from one world, it felt like you just kind of knew him, right? So I think being able to kind of form a message that isn't super, multiple levels deep, that's just kind of like, here's what we stand for. You don't have to have a college degree to understand this, right? I think that's number one. And then your second part about the economy and kind of progressive economics. I think something that would be interesting to see if any of the Democratic potential nominees for 2028 pick up is a theme of economic patriotism. So the U.S., and obviously I think I'm a little biased. This comes from my work with a group called the Liberal Patriot. We think patriotism is generally a good thing, not blind patriotism, but love of country is a good thing. And I think a way that you might be able to bring some of that frame into questions about the economy and about people's day-to-day lives is, look, we want the United States to be a place where people invest. We want it to be a place where everybody has skin in the game. Everybody feels like they have a piece of the pie. And we're not going to give a hand up, but we do want to give a hand up. We want to be a party that helps people be upwardly mobile. And so some of that might be, hey, we need to have a robust safety net to make sure people don't fall through the cracks so that they can, have a bare minimum, their bare minimum needs met, and they can kind of work from there. Some of it, though, to your point, might be reflecting on kind of what I don't want to say is necessarily reflexive, but I think in some ways reflexive defense of the regulatory system and that kind of thing, right? I think the abundance agenda is interesting in this regard. It takes a look at a lot of heavily Democratic controlled states like California and New York and these places where it's really hard to build. I think it's become almost a running joke how the high-speed rail in California that they tried, 10 years ago to run from San Francisco to LA. And now they said, maybe we can run it from, two cities in the middle of nowhere that nobody's going to take. And it's going to cost $100 billion because there's so many hoops to run through. Right. And so if you're the Democrats, I think saying, look, we want this to be a place where we build, I think kind of almost tapping back into the FDR era energy of we want to build, we want to get people to work, we want to get people to work in jobs that they feel proud of, right? And some of that may require us to, not kind of embrace our old ways of doing things, not to embrace the government being involved in every step of the way, because this is just a good thing for Americans. It helps people be upwardly mobile. It helps people buy homes. It's really hard to buy homes in a lot of places right now. And part of that is because there is a lack of inventory because it's hard to build in certain places. And so saying, look, we think it's important to have an abundance of homes. This is good because this gets people into that middle-class lifestyle where they can live, own their home, build equity, right? And these are the kinds of things that over time will also help hopefully kind of tip the playing field a little bit more toward a balance, right? And where people who feel like they've been locked out of a lot of middle-class living can kind of see themselves, oh, I have a path to the middle class now, right?
And it doesn't have to necessarily be. I mean, I put right in this piece, and I think I suggested a moment ago, I think it behooves Democrats here. Boy, there's a $20 word. Yeah, I don't sound like an elite. Don't worry about me. It behooves me. It behooves us to, we got to throw some arrows at our own sacred cows here, to mix metaphors for a second. I think that buys us credibility. I think it bought Bill Clinton credibility when he said the era of big government is over. Yep. Being willing to call out things that, are usually associated with your own side is a good thing. It doesn't mean you need to go full MAGA either. And I want to bring in, to your point, the third part of the haiku, which was don't forget healthcare. because that's a really important part of this. We're right in the midst of Republicans trying to decide how much to hack away at Medicaid. Huge, huge issue. And one of the things I say in the piece is that, it's both sides of the coin for people. People want opportunity and an income ladder. They want a pathway to feeling proud of their job, feeling good about it, feeling like they're earning their income. They also need help because they're getting squeezed. The key components of middle-class costs, healthcare,
security,
housing, right? It's insecure and it's too much money. Pay for childcare, people. I know you out there. I know you know what I'm talking about. Pay for childcare. It is just a withering experience. Let me give you a message here that I've kind of culled from a good communicator, and that kind of ties this together, right? This is, I'm quoting here. For the better part of 50 years, working wages have been flat in real terms. Working people cannot afford to get married when they want to, have the number of children they want to, or raise those children as they would like. These days, they can barely afford to put a roof over their kids' heads, to say nothing of healthcare. Congress should be doing everything possible to aid working families to make their healthcare better, more affordable. We should cap prescription drug costs. We should give every family in America with children a hefty tax cut. What we should not do is eliminate their healthcare. Both Democrats and Republicans share the blame for the state of affairs, which is one big reason Trump got elected. He promised to shake up the status quo. You know who said that? And I'm sorry, I'm going to say goodbye to everyone because the lightning is about to strike me. This is the end. I'm signing off forever and ever. Josh Hawley wrote that. Senator Josh Hawley, that guy. Yeah, Mr. Stands
was that
with
today?
a fist to the Jan 6 protesters. He wrote that in the New York Times, an impassioned defense of Medicaid. Look, he is horrible. He is terrible, okay? I'm not like, but it goes to the point that he has put his finger, he says it outright. He says the quiet part out loud right in this New York Times piece. It's worth your time. It's worth your time. He says, we need to be a populist party, Republicans. We're not going to do that, taking away this critical safety net for people that so many working people, working Americans rely on. And so I think I'm quoting this. I'm quoting the devil himself because there's some message alchemy in there that I think is worth Democrats paying attention to. He did do a pretty good job tying together in that piece the idea of people want to work, they want opportunity, they want the income side to be full of opportunity, and they also need help on the cost side. They need the insecurity and stress that healthcare costs create taken off the table for them. And whoever can do that, whoever can be the party of this ain't working, the system ain't working, and we've got to fix it. We've got to blow things up if necessary in order to make life affordable and to make it so that you, to quote Bill again, you work, you play by the rules, you're going to get ahead in America. Yeah. That's I think the compass point for Democrats. And once again, I apologize for quoting Josh Hawley. Temporary insanity. Sorry. Okay.
No, I mean, I think it's a great point. Look, people know the saying, right? If you don't have your health, you don't have anything. And I think, maybe one way to think about this, if you're the Democrats, in terms of how do you kind of capitalize on your advantage on this issue, because it is true. I mean, it is interesting. Right after the election, or maybe a couple months after the election, the firm Blue Rose Research put out a bunch of post-election data, survey data, and one of them was gauging which issues each party had an advantage on. The Democrats' advantage on most issues had slipped, but one place that they still were just slightly, even though they had slipped a little bit there as well, but just slightly had an advantage, was on healthcare and on Medicaid and Medicare. And this kind of follows a long history of the Democrats being the party that people trust more on this issue. And I think this is, even though it seems like the big issue in everybody in the surveys right now that people care most about is cost of living, and I think these two are related. And healthcare doesn't always necessarily pop as the top thing for people. I think you're right that it feeds into this question of feelings of security. And, I think that this is maybe another kind of theme that maybe one or both of us could explore in future piece is that, when you don't feel secure in your own life, in your family, in your community, you are a lot more likely to look to people who offer that security. And so if you feel less secure because of COVID and because Donald Trump wasn't able to sufficiently respond to it in the way that made you feel secure, you went to Biden. If you didn't feel secure in your community because you were reading these stories about how porous the southern border was, you maybe decide, okay, I'm going to move from Joe Biden to Donald Trump. And I think now healthcare kind of ties into this as well, right? If you don't feel secure that if you lose your job, all of a sudden you're not going to get your preventive treatments, your cancer treatment, whatever it might be, that's pretty destabilizing. And so I think for Democrats, maybe a way that they can kind of think about countering Trump, and especially now that Republicans have kind of gone on this warpath against Medicaid, and potentially, if they are successful, then who knows if Medicare is next. I think Democrats would be wise to claim that they are the party of security, that they are the party that wants to help you be upwardly mobile, and that if you're down on your luck, you're not going to fall through the cracks either. And I think healthcare, because they have had this long-standing advantage on this issue, that's the perfect way to do it.
I want to tie a couple of threads together here as we head down the final straightaway here toward the finish line. First of all, just to pick up on your very last point, I wrote a piece years and years ago. It was during the primary, the 2020 Democratic primary, in which I picked up on the best policy idea I had seen in the primary. And I am kind of a center left kind of guy. I'm not a Bernie Sanders kind of guy, but it came from Bernie, and it was to erase people's healthcare debt. Turns out that forget student loan debt for a second. I mean, that's easy for me to say. Our household actually has a lot of student debt left, so it's not that easy for me to say. But you really want to hit people where it would help. Hit them in the healthcare debt. Average debt at the time was like $600. It was pushing people into bankruptcy, a source of so much insecurity, stress, financial peril for people, so easily covered. Stacey Abrams' own organization actually went in and did something about this in Georgia, your neck of the woods, wiped out debt, healthcare debt for tens of thousands of people. So this is a doable thing. I think Democrats walking the walk on that kind of thing would be a good step. I think however we do it, though, we have to first decide we are going to embrace change, because one of the comments that I flashed up on the screen that I think is super important, and several other people, Lefty Gramps is in on this. There's a bunch of people making comments like Cynthia Rice is here. The GOP wants us to be insecure. This takes me back to something that Congressman Jamie Raskin said on my show, on this show on Beyond Politics. We also go out on the Beyond Politics podcast. I forgot to say that about a year ago, that insecurity, the sense that things are out of control, that's part of the authoritarian project. People have been saying in the comments, we have to get the proto-fascists out first, and then we can do some of these things that we want to do. And that's true. I agree with that. And I think the challenge for us, it takes us back to where you started, which is whatever the truth of the matter is, Joe Biden was a heck of a lot more in command of his faculties than Donald Trump. That is true. It's not the way voters are seeing it. And that's the challenge for Democrats, is that we have to find a way. The Republican project right now, the Trump project, is to make us feel like there's an emergency, to make us feel like things are spiraling out of control, to make us think that things are insecure. You put right into your piece some Gallup polling, right track, wrong track. A fun project, if you're a freaking nerd like me, I did this, mea culpa, is to go pull the underlying data and look at right track, wrong tracker for the last 50 years. Turns out the median number is about 2/3 of Americans thinking we're on the wrong track. And in the last decade, it's higher. It's higher. It's above 70%. So Americans are unhappy. For any parents out there, if you've ever had a really cranky, I'm not infantilizing Americans. I'm not. I'm just making a metaphor here, people. If you've ever had a really cranky toddler who's not quite able to voice what's bothering them, that's a lot of what voters have been saying for 50 years. We don't like what's happening. We're cranky. We're unhappy. We want something different. We want something to change. And the challenge for Democrats right now, that as you and I clearly see it, is we need to embrace that. We need to be the party of change. We need to show people in very clear terms, simple terms, here are the things we're going to change. It's about economics. It's about your income. It's about your opportunity. And it's about your costs and your stress. And we are laser focused on those things. And we're going to take away that sense of insecurity, that sense of emergency. We can't feed into it. And it's like a catch-22. The more we get distracted, this was part of your piece this morning, the more we get distracted by the latest Trump outrage of the moment, the more it feeds into what Cynthia was saying. The Republicans and Donald Trump want us to be insecure. So I just gave a fantastic filibuster part 2, the return of the filibuster. And I want to give you the last word as we head out here, because I really do try to finish these things in about an hour. So final word over to you.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think, this has been a good discussion, first of all. So thank you again for having me on. Yeah, it's hard, when you're the party that believes that government, is not a nefarious force, that can be a good force in people's lives, to be the defenders of it in a time when people have soured on it. And to your point, it's not anything new. I think this really stems back to, the Vietnam War days, and then Watergate. And, there's been a lot of periods where Americans have felt that the country was going on the wrong track. And the latest of which has been the past at least decade or so. So, I wish there were easy answers. And I think for the Democrats, part of this is a realization that you're not going to reform people's attitudes overnight, but you got to start somewhere. And I think for a lot of people, they want to just be able to live their lives with the hope of a better tomorrow, for them, for their kids, for their future generations. And, right now, they just don't feel it. And I think a lot of people have diagnosed this. You've got Bernie, you've got Trump, you have had Obama before all that. You have a lot of people who are starting to get wise to this. Even Josh Hawley is starting to recognize that maybe the old sort of free market winners and losers, social Darwinism ways of, let's say, the Paul Ryan GOP, that's not the way forward for them. We'll see if where their party goes from here on that. But if you're the Democrats, I think it's going to start taking an honest accounting of where government has gone wrong, and a clear vision for people of how your party will fix things. And frankly, one way I think that they can start this, it doesn't even have to be at the presidential level. It can start in cities and states. I think a lot of people think that Democrats and the government more broadly don't work. It's broken. Is they look at places like California, they look at places like New York, where they're very expensive. People are leaving. Their population is declining. And they're saying, you guys can't even govern your own backyards. Why should we entrust you with this power? And then, think that the government is going to be able to work and make my life better. And I think it's a lot easier to handle things in your backyard than it is at the federal level with the massive bureaucracy that the United States has. And so I think one way to kind of regain that trust is to show people, to model for people, hey, this works. Look at what we're doing in San Francisco. Look at what we're doing in New York City. Look at what we're doing in the Twin Cities, right? We are governing these places in ways that are raising standards of living, keeping people from feeling like they're falling through the cracks, and making them hopeful about, government being able to work for them again. So, I think that's kind of the ethos that, Democrats at all levels, candidates running across the country, should try and capture, and should try to, where they can, turn into reality, to give people, more reassurances that, hey, their way works, right? You just have to kind of, give them some time. You have to, trust that that they understand what has frustrated people in the past and what they're going to do differently. And I don't think that Democrats are locked out of power forever. I mean, we're in a very close two-party system, and I think they will have as good a chance as the Republicans in 2028, but they have some work to do before then.
Michael Baharaeen, first of all, thank you very much for being on. People should check out, and it's up on the screen, Checks and Balances and the Liberal Patriot, which is where I first came across your writing. There's a lot of great stuff on there, and it is the kind of thing that kind of goes after some of these sacred cows in the Democratic Party, and not afraid to ask some questions about what is it going to take to beat these guys. Super duper important to do. And I really want to thank all of the people who have been on and commenting. I'm putting my stuff up on the screen right now. Best place to find my work, including in Newsweek, the Beyond Politics podcast, and the work of many of the colleagues that I've brought in here, and I refeature some of Cliff's work, etc., is on the Worth Knowing Substack. I also want to say, just on a kind of a technical note, I really appreciate the fact that the viewership has been rising throughout the hour. I know that I am the source of some technical problems for the Substack portion of this. I keep wondering, like, where are all the Substack people? There is a problem going on. I reached out to the Substack people because the live stream seems to be tricky there. So anyway, this will all end up on that feed, and we will get it fixed hopefully by next time. But thank you for all of you joining through Cliff's Edge, and we will wrap it up there. So I will see you next week. We've got some outstanding guests coming on. We may get another Spanish Inquisition. Cliff flits in and out, pops up. You don't know. He emerges from the bookshelf in the next couple of weeks. Looking forward to that as well. So thanks to Michael. Thanks to everyone for being on and hanging out with us. And we will see you next week.